this is kind of an extension of that film that that I put together, in that it's about creating awareness. So rural America is, Minnesota kind of flies under the radar. Rural America flies under the radar with the rest of the world too. So this idea kind of came out of that. So I'll say right now, this is kind of a practice run for me, because I'm going to be doing this as a TED Talk up in Brainerd. So TEDx Gull Lake called me. They stumbled on the film and said, hey, can you come talk about tech? Because we'd like to get tech out there in a community that otherwise, really doesn't have much of anything. So this is basically a dry run. So I have, content pretty well laid out, but I don't have it all memorized. So you guys can let me know what you think. But the passion is around, similar with that of the film, that we need tech talent in the Twin Cities. We've got a lot of opportunity in front of us, and we're really growing. But the problem is if we don't have enough resources, we're not going to continue to be able to grow. Rural America is, that landscape of jobs is changing tremendously. So a lot of manufacturing jobs, a lot of the cores that built those rural areas is really changing. And really, I think that one of the biggest issues here is we are a nation divided extraordinarily, as much as any other time in our country. We're kind of this series of blue islands in a sea of red. And so there's the business side of it, there's kind of the human side of it, and then there's the kind of the political side of it. But I think this is a way to kind of pull all those three together. So my challenge is I have about a 10-minute TED Talk. So we've got about, I think, like 40 or 50 minutes. So what I want to do is I want to go through, and I'm kind of extending, this to be probably 20 to 30 minutes. And then as we go, I want each of you to think about ideas, because if you are from rural Minnesota, or if you can give me some perspectives from rural Minnesota or other areas, people feel passionate about this, right? Because they have families, if they came from farms, or they're trying to figure out ways to engage. And I had a bunch of people reach out to me. They said, hey, I'd like to figure out how do I participate in solving this issue. So think about, write down any feedback you have for me. Let's talk about it after. And any ideas that you have, let's definitely try to kind of make the second half of this a working session. So in the 1960s, a philosopher from Czechoslovakia by the name of Radovan Richta coined the term technological evolution, a theory about how societies diminish labor by increasing mental labor. So it's a simple concept with three stages. First comes the tool. A tool provides us with a mechanical advantage over doing something by hand. So for instance, a screwdriver. Next is mechanization. Powered machines improve on the tool, so it needs only control and less labor. So think of a drill that does the twisting of the screwdriver for you. Now, the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century gave us mechanization and spurred massive amount of growth on an industrial scale across the world. The third and final stage is that of automation. Now, this stage removes the need for human control by being replaced with a repeatable process or algorithm. The technology revolution of the 21st century has given us automation, along with it a very changing labor market. In 1947, General Motors established an automation department. By the 1980s, automation was advancing auto manufacturing by leaps and bounds, helping to drive the factory to from looking like this to this. Now, this intense evolution of technology was a wonder to manufacturing industry, allowing us to create more with less. It increased competition, drove innovation, and created an industry full of new jobs. It also killed manufacturing jobs. So today, nearly 2/3 of rural counties in the US lost businesses from 2010 to 2014. In urban centers, we continue to be faced with a shortage of technology talent. So we have what's called negative unemployment, where we cannot find enough workers to fill the jobs that we have. So you have this massive divide between urban centers and rural America. Naturally, this has created a tremendous amount of conflict. So this disparity between the loss of manufacturing jobs in rural counties and growth of jobs in urban centers has contributed to creating one of the most polarized electorates in our nation's history. And while politicians promise otherwise, the unfortunate reality is that those manufacturing jobs are not coming back. So what if there was a way to bridge this divide by bringing tech jobs to rural America? Now, I think there is. So I mentioned documentary. Now, I went on this journey in 2015 to make a film, to really shed a light on our tech industry in Minnesota. So on that journey, I learned a tremendous amount of things, starting with the history that we kind of walked through a little bit this morning. Companies like Honeywell, 3M, General Mills were completely changing our world in the 50s and 60s after the war. Control Data was building something called a computer that allowed us to automate tasks. So something that most Minnesotans don't even know is that Control Data was the largest computer manufacturer, or Minnesota was the largest computer manufacturer in the 1960s. Control Data was a darling of Wall Street, is a billion-dollar company. So as I mentioned earlier, much like we in Minnesota fly under the radar in terms of like a technology ecosystem, that people in the 60s might remember us, but people today don't. So too does rural America feel under the radar. And I want to bring up some examples of places that rural communities or larger cities, but further out in rural America, that are actually changing and innovating. So part of my journey with the film brought me to Rochester. They're innovating with healthcare and technology. So not far from St. Paul, where Controlled Data changed the world of computing, Rochester was innovating healthcare and technology. Long known for Mayo Clinic and IBM, Rochester is creating a new discipline with some of the startups that are happening down there. So their startup ecosystem is growing with co-working spaces, meetups, conferences, and new startups, such as a company called GoRoute. They're one of many sports tech companies that are in Minnesota, this new industry that is one of our rising stars in the sports tech space. So they're building a new landscape in southern Minnesota. Anybody from North Dakota? So Fargo is actually growing, is really booming with tech, and specifically they're booming with drone technology. So a group there called Emerging Prairie is really helping to support the community by creating a supportive entrepreneurial ecosystem. And they're doing this in a few ways. They're connecting people by bringing them together at things like co-working spaces and events. They're creating platforms for them to get their ideas out into the market. So they have demos just like we have a mini demo. They've got meetups. They're supporting them by trying to connect them with customers, investors, and support employees, that kind of thing. So that has, essentially, they have a hub, just like we have a mini star here. They're kind of doing that there as well. So they are quickly becoming a key player on the global stage with drone technology and agriculture. So both of those are 100,000 plus cities, but what about smaller towns? So Red Wing has a solid effort underway to build up a technology and startup ecosystem with their population of roughly 15,000. They're part of what's called Ignite US. And Ignite US, what they do is they're kind of a network to help cities develop their areas into entrepreneurial ecosystems. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. But they, too, are building code camps, co-working spaces, internships, and partners with education institutions to try to build up a startup and tech community. So behind all of these communities exist some common elements that foster a productive entrepreneurial and technology startup ecosystem. And one of those is spaces. So you have to have spaces that allow entrepreneurs with ideas to bounce off of one another. And so Coco, if you've been there, is a tremendous place. And Don Ball from Coco referred to it as a coral reef. So it's many different species in the ecosystem mixing together with ideas and support. And they're really helping to contribute to each other. So there's service providers, there's startups with new ideas, but you go down there and everybody kind of knows each other, and the networking effect is very powerful. The next is entrepreneurial ecosystems have events. And so this is everything from meetups to hackathons. Here we have Startup Week, which is a tremendous gathering over an entire week of all sorts of different events. There's things like TEDx, Minibar is a perfect example of that. We have hundreds more here, but those are part of what happens in Rochester, in Red Wing, in Fargo, that are helping build those ecosystems and allow us to exchange ideas, learn from one another, and connect with like-minded folks. So I met my videographer for the film project at a conference, and I networked and I got my idea out there at a conference, and I talked about it at Minibar last year. So all of these things were contributing to my ability to network with other people, get feedback from the community, and allow me to get that idea in front of people and validate it or get rid of it. So I would not have been able to make that film without these important areas. So demo events such as mini demo are what are referred to as platforms in order to get your idea out there. So anybody not been to mini demo? If you haven't been to mini demo, you should definitely be at mini demo. People are able to get up on stage and show their product to 1,000 people, and it really allows them to connect with others, with potential customers, with co-founders, investors, employees, everything. And again, these are developing in all of these communities. Successful communities are also part of a broader community. So as I mentioned, Ignite US, that's one that is connecting, not just connecting Red Wing within itself, but helping to build them, but they're also connecting Red Wing with others around the community. And so they leverage the power of these existing networks. So Ignite US, TEDx, Techstars is a great example. So they're giving you the support, but they're also connecting you with other communities. So along the way with some of these elements, these common elements that allow ecosystems to thrive, partner, and grow, exist common challenges. And the three of the many key ones, are a misperception of tech, out-of-date education, and a lack of opportunity. So tech has a misperception, particularly in kind of the not only in our urban centers, but in rural areas particularly. It's not cool, it's too hard, it'll change our community. So we need to work together to really change those misperceptions. So first with jobs, you talk to tech with talk about tech with somebody that doesn't know tech, and they kind of think, well, that means coding. That means I have to have math, or it means I have to be really good at things. So while we do need engineers, we need Java and .NET and front end, but we also need designers, project managers, product owners, business analysts. We need all sorts of folks that contribute to the ecosystem. And I think that part of the challenge with tech is just to get past those misperceptions and not just, we just need this particular stripe of cat, but to say that these days, tech is far beyond just coding. So we need to change some of those misperceptions with folks in rural communities. They also think it's too difficult if they do want to get into code. And I challenge that concept wholeheartedly. Because I think that everybody's afraid of things like the math component, or you have to be a rocket scientist or a computer science major to be a part of tech and to do any coding. And I believe this is patently untrue. So when I talk about this, I think of how do I relay that into more simple terms? So I think about, going back to the manufacturing model. Let's think of code like a car. Code is built on logic. There's math, but mostly built on logic. So if you are building a car and you put that car in to drive, it's going to go forward. If you put it in reverse, it's going to go backwards. Now, there are various levels. Of course, it gets much more complicated than that. But really, it's logic. So if we said, if the shifter is in drive, move forward. Pretty simple stuff. We can start at a very fundamental basis. So my thesis there is that tech is not above anybody. To some form or another, everyone can learn to code. Which brings us to our next challenge of an out-of-date education system. So we need to fundamentally rebuild education on a variety of fronts, and technology is probably the most ripe for change. We need an upgrade. It needs to focus on educating youth for the jobs that are going to be out there tomorrow. And one of the biggest challenges that's out there is teachers. So there generally are not enough teachers that know enough about code. Now, there are many challenges here, is that teaching a very changing technology is super tough. I've been on boards, I've been associated with schools, I've built curriculum, and the real challenges there is that every year or two, some technology will come in and out of favor, and then it has to change. So the problem is that teachers go to school to teach. They don't necessarily go to school for programming. You also have an incentive problem. If you're a coder right now, your opportunity to get in and be a contributor to any company versus an educator is probably a 1 to 4, 1 to 5 pay scale. Education doesn't pay enough. There's too many problems with that. So we can do a lot of things to get in front of this. This problem is not isolated to rural America, by the way. This problem happens here in all of our schools locally. So some school districts are doing okay. Some of them are not. But fundamentally, we need to start with kids. And this is very much a collaborative effort. So this is the school districts, this is the teachers, this is the parents, this is the kids. And again, we have the same problem in inner cities as we do in rural America. We got to make it cool. We have to show a pathway of how kids can be successful. And I believe that we can do this. There's so many programs out there now. You got robotics, you've got things like video games, you've got online courses, YouTube. Anybody can jump online and start to learn how to code and show their kids how to code. There's so many cool products out there. And one of them I've been exploring a little more recently is called Scratch. Does anybody know what Scratch? So MIT put together this program, and it's really focused on trying to expose kids to the fundamentals. And one of the basic levels, if we're building something from scratch tomorrow, you have to have technology literacy. It has to start there. You have to have, like, St. Paul has a one-to-one program with one-to-one MacBooks or Chromebooks or iPads or whatever. So there has to be some sort of basis for that. And all schools should have some degree of requirement for that. And I think that there's a lot of different ways that we can do that. One of the issues is that there's a math requirement, but there's not a computer science requirement. So as I was talking to the St. Paul School District, saying, well, why isn't there a computer science requirement? You've got groups like MHTA are trying to figure out how can we put that into place. And I don't know if this is exactly county by county or if it's state by state or whatever, but there can be ways in which we create an equivalency or something along that line so that we have to kind of force kids, just like we do with math, to be exposed to that. Now, Scratch is one of those ways you can go home and start teaching your kids this tomorrow. It's pretty simple drag and drop stuff. Again, this is like the car. If I do this, it's going to do that. Very logic based, but there are ways to engage kids. So next we need to really focus on teaching entrepreneurship. Now, in rural America, there is a ton of entrepreneurship. So these are the same folks that started farms and bait shops and local stores. And that entrepreneurship exists in rural America as much as it does anywhere else. So entrepreneurship as an education component of what we need. Our big companies need that. So in terms of, there's teaching technology and then there's teaching the entrepreneurship and giving people the space to fail and try again. And culturally need to nurture that. One of the things that we can also do is we need to establish those clear pathways. And with tech being a very non-traditional thing, a lot of technologists never went to school for it. So we have, as a society, this kind of broken architecture of how education is supposed to be. We continue to see things like, massive amounts of student debt and a lot of people that don't actually do what they went to school for. So while having a degree helps in technology, if you're going to be an architect, if you're going to work in an object-oriented language, having a 4-year degree based on the fundamentals and the principles of object-oriented languages, super helpful. But you don't necessarily need that if you want to be doing some form of a tech career. There's 2-year schools, there's boot camps, and then there's DIY. And I think that we have to get out there as much as possible, not only locally, but also in those rural centers, is that, again, this isn't rocket science. You don't necessarily need these things. These are tools. Let's get stories out there. A lot of developers can raise their hand and say, look, I never even went to school. After I dropped out of college the first year or whatever, and I did this and this and this, I taught myself tech along the way. So my story is, I left school, focused on my career, learned a lot of tech by myself in my job with my peers, went back to school for business. Like, I have a totally non-traditional pathway when it comes to that. And I think that those types of stories need to get out so that people can say, oh, there is another option other than having to drop $100,000 on going to a 4-year school. So there's also a lack of opportunity in rural areas. So you don't generally see posting for Java developers in Brainerd, Minnesota. Now, we can fix this through a variety of ways. We have to start with companies investing back into those communities. So they can help fund co-working spaces. They can help us change and upgrade our education system. They can offer remote positions. Companies can do a lot of things. And to me, financially, it makes all the sense in the world. And it really comes down to basics of economics 101. So the market forces of supply and demand are completely out of whack. In a tight resource market that we have here in many other urban centers, the seller sets the price. So technology jobs here in the Twin Cities are now they're growing on average double digits every year. Now, if you think about that and you create market equilibrium, those high prices will go back down. So if you have $1 million budget and you can only afford 4 developers, what if you could take market equilibrium and get 12? And again, this tech is not stacked in the sense of you need 10 architects. You need a couple architects, and then you need a couple of mid-level developers, and then you maybe need a couple of intro developers. And that's where we can start to really kind of bracket what we need and what the community can offer us in terms of rural Minnesota. So balancing or rebalancing the economics of supply and demand will be beneficial to companies to invest into rural communities. Now, on the rural community front, it's important to build a brand. It's not just like, hey, we're going to be a tech community. What's important is to figure out what are you good at and how can we add technology to that. So Fargo didn't just decide we're going to be a tech community. Fargo said, what are we good at? We're good at agriculture. North Dakota has some of the richest land in the country. And we have to find ways to leverage that technology and become known for something. So now when I think of Fargo, I think about drones. And that's a super important way. I think that the future is going to change in terms of how we engage with each of these communities. I think we can also offer internships. And this is a huge area that frustrates me on a local level, but also could be one of the answers on a rural level. So think about baseball. Baseball built its empire grassroots through farm leagues. And so my position is that tech needs a farm league. So baseball scouts, they go around, they find the best players, they develop them into a tiered system of farm leagues. They go from farm leagues into the minors, into the majors, and this exists today. So if we can take scouts from companies to go around into high schools, into rural areas, and identify talent and find ways to invest in that talent and create those farm leagues, we can create a laddering system, as I mentioned, within the brackets of entry-level tech, mid-level tech, and then really the major players or the architects. So one of the aspects is the advent of technology and network that gives us the ability to do remote working. So teleconferencing, video conferencing happens every day. Millions of people do this. You've got companies like When I Work that has a distributed team all across the country. So they are not, their challenge is finding the resources locally. They're competing with Target, everybody else. The real challenge is finding enough workers, and if they have to go outside, they've been doing that. Now, putting jobs back in rural America is a huge job, and it really takes collaboration on both sides. And I look at this as a bridge project. It's two groups working on different sides of the bridge to bring us together. And we need to remember, in our urban centers, that rural America was founded by entrepreneurs, building farms, factories, cities. These are very smart, hardworking people, engineers, manufacturers, everything from farming to aerospace. On the rural side, we need leaders to step up and build innovation into that culture. We need the entrepreneurship that started all of those things to engage and to build a new way of community building. And so to me, this really starts with a conversation. Tech needs to reach out, and rural America needs to reach in. We need to reach out to the Rochesters and the Brainards of the world and say, hey, how can we help? And it's identifying the people in those communities that are doing something that want to change. So the folks in those rural areas need to raise their hand and say, hey, I'm really interested in what happened in Rochester. How can I do that? What's going on in Red Wing? If you reach out to any of those people, they will respond to your email. They will have a coffee. They will meet you halfway. And that's how we're actually able to get something moving. So it's all about starting a conversation. Now, success to me means many different things. We can put rural America back to work. We can rebuild those local economies, as today those towns are dying. We can fuel our businesses with talent at all levels of the technology spectrum. We can equalize the supply and demand. And I think most importantly, we can reconnect as a country. And so my advice to everybody on both the rural and urban side is just to start something. Start anything. Start a meetup, start a co-working space, start a Google search, start an email, start a conversation. So as we go into the ideas section of this, one of my ideas is to find a way to reach out and to kind of have a centralized unit, at least until we can kind of patchwork everybody together. So as I reached out and I talked to folks in Rochester, in North Dakota, and Red Wing, what I realized is they're already talking to each other. Like, they're reaching out to each other and saying, hey, how did you do this? So Jamie Sunsback in Rochester, when I talked to him, he's like, yeah, I talked to Greg Tavine in Fargo, and he said, I have to do this, and I have to do this, and I have to do this, and we did it. And it's really helping us. We brought TEDx to us. We brought 1 million cups. Again, this community of communities. And so just the ability to have Greg available for Jamie to help him build his community, I think is super important. So one of my ideas would be, let's find a way to take our community advocates in the Twin Cities and connect them with community advocates in anywhere in Minnesota. So you've got the mini stars here. We have this hub, this flywheel. But how can we create a flywheel that really helps and reaches out to our rural counterparts? So not only connecting the Twin Cities to go out and say, hey, where can we help? We have a framework, and that framework is some of the common elements that I talked about, but also rural America reaching in and saying, hey, we want to do that. Like, my town's dying, or my town is changing, and we're struggling with jobs. And how can we re-engage and use some of that framework that you have to plug that in? Because I think that one thing I've learned about Minnesota along my journeys is we're so helpful. We want to help other people, and we're also very proud of our city and of our state. So I think that we can somehow create a collective, formal or informal, to reach out to all of those communities. And I look at this very much like a tree. So a tree starts with a trunk. It has branches, and has smaller branches, twigs, etc. And I think that we can somehow build a pipeline of talent, education, and opportunity through those networks. So we're connecting into Rochester, and the better we can build a bridge between here and Rochester, then we can support Rochester, and then Rochester can start to support the other surrounding communities. And if we can really build that framework out, then I think we as Minnesotans are doing our best to reconnect, to create those jobs, and really build our economy. So that's my idea, is to come up with some sort of a centralized hub to help rural America with support, ideas, networks, people, jobs, whatever we can.
I have a slight issue with how you define rural America. 100,000 person city is not rural. 50,000 is rural. I come from originally northwest Iowa. My home county is under 10,000 people.
Right.
And then when I think rural, that's what I think of rural. And they are, and those areas are seriously rural.
Mm-hmm.
And we talk about being able to bring people things there, and it'd be great, but they're struggling with internet connectivity, cellular connectivity. A lot of people with vision have left. I mean, not just my county, but other places. How do you bring those people back? That's ultimately what you have to start looking at. How do you start bringing things up? So whether it be tech or whatever, you want to get those people with that entrepreneurial spirit still going. So it's. So I look at rural as a lot less than what you are.
Right, and I recognize that as, you know, the Rochesters and Fargos are maybe not rural in that context. Maybe they're outstate cities, but part of that, I think ultimately part of that network that you know feeds into each other. So I mean I agree. I totally agree. My wife's family is from Shenandoah in southwestern Iowa, and I walk through that and I see that town dying, and I see a factory. Pella Windows, if that factory goes away, that town will collapse.
Yes.
And so offering this is one of the ways in which they might be able to leverage their existing industries and finding innovative ways to keep that going so that they can, because part of it is, you know, with rural communities is like once the school goes, the town's dead.
Yes.
So how do you either slow that down, or let somebody go back to their, maybe as they're taking care of their, you know, parents or whatever they have to go back there for or want to go back there, and allow them some opportunity to re-engage and help build that town back up is part of it. You know, you look at Minnesota, you got MHTA trying to really figure broadband statewide.
Yep.
Absolutely, that is part of it. If you can't have internet access, the entire theory of co-working spaces, all of that stuff totally goes out the window.
Infrastructure is being ignored in rural areas.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because, especially with communications, you have a very smaller population, very spread out, and it gets very expensive to do.
Yep.
And they have to be pushed to do it. But places like Wilmer, I think it's Wilmer, that's running fiber to the premise. There are rural communities here that are, you know, small mom and pops that are running fiber to the premise, fiber everywhere. And that's kind of what's needed. I mean, it's not the end-all, be-all, but it's the next step.
Well, it's part of the solution.
Yes.
So I should perhaps put that in my deck of infrastructure
Yes.
as a critical component.
Infrastructure determines your applications, and applications determine your infrastructure. It's not just a technology, but a business and just a culture.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
There are also some, I think you should also consider leveraging the networks that do pull those small communities, I'm from Northwest Iowa too, pull those small communities together, like the extension services, the local colleges. These are things that people are already communicating across vast distances with. So if you want, you know, a technological person or oriented idea maker in one small town to connect with someone 40 to 50 miles away, they might be connected through an Iowa State Extension Service or a local community college or a church function or a school district, because the more rural you get, the bigger those districts get in mileage. And so sometimes you really have to kind of cook it back up to those schools.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, because it's part of a network. I mean,
there's value in creating the infrastructure, but why don't you lay those lines along the pathways that are already there,
mm-hmm.
as opposed to like trying to create something out of nothing and getting the horses to go.
Sure. Well, and the money's going to go where to some extent there already exists something. Like that's where the investment will go. So if you're Comcast, you're going to say, you know, that's the unfortunate reality with some of these, is that some of those towns are going to die because Comcast is going to say, what's my ROI going out to that? And, you know, that's, to that point, the counties that have potential are the ones that are going to get the fiber.
Unless they do it themselves.
Unless they do it themselves. Right. Again, I think that's that internal leadership and entrepreneurship.
Yes, I think when you start looking at larger corporations, they aren't going to necessarily do the investment because the ROI isn't there.
Right.
I think a lot of it is if rural communities and rural areas want to succeed again, because they used to be very successful. I think if they want to succeed again, they're going to have to be pulling themselves up by their own bootstraps. They're going to have to get levers in place and get money, get local investors around them. There are people with money there, but people are tight like everything, and those people are actually kind of falling down, like farmers consolidating. But they can actually start consolidating and get investments going there. They're going to have to start doing things on their own, I'm afraid.
Mm-hmm.
Just to give an example of success in bringing good infrastructure to a small community, I recently moved with my wife a couple hours away from here, like an hour southeast of Rochester, in the very southeast of the state. And one of the reasons I was able to move there was because I could do my development job remotely, and the small town is like a town of 1,200, and they have a telecommunications co-op that basically runs fiber out to the surrounding area, and so just that was enticing enough for us to, it's hard to afford. She's a farmer, so my wife is, so it's hard to afford land around here, but going out that far was affordable, and then I could do my job and make that happen. And so, and then just that because of that, I feel like the town's been thriving, and so it's a co-op, and so at the end of the day, if they're well run, everybody gets their money back, and it's a good, but somebody had to make that initial investment, of course, to get that started.
Sure.
But now it's paid dividends for the town, and they've been able to put in a new single screen movie theater, they have an art gallery, and they're definitely thriving, whereas around there, other towns haven't had the same amount of success.
What's the name of the town?
Spring Grove?
Spring Grove.
Yeah.
Okay. So you said less than 10,000?
Yeah, it's 1,200.
Oh,
people.
okay. Spring Grove.
Yeah.
Huh. I'll have to remember that.
Cool. So, not necessarily thinking about the monetary side, but I'm curious who the people in Rochester are that try to start the conversations, because obviously people have full-time jobs. So I mean, are those people chamber people that started those conversations, or were they just regular people with full-time jobs too, doing it on the side kind of thing?
Well, I think so. Rochester's a unique one because it's such a conservative community. Doctors and some tech with IBM there, but very institutionalized in the sense of you have these big corporations and you go work at the big corporations. I think what's changing with Rochester is the DMC movement, the Destination Medical Center, because they appreciate that their Mayo Clinic, they're one of the biggest brands in the world when it comes to healthcare, but they're also not going to continue to do that just because of the changing globalization and access to, it's not just Mayo anymore. They're competing with others. And so the only way that they're going to, it's the same deal with the schools in rural areas, if you don't have a job for your spouse, why are you going to move there? If you don't have a great school system for your kids that allows them to do something other than be a doctor, why are you going to move there? So I think that entire movement towards the Destination Medical Center got people in the community to start paying attention to that and helping support the people that said, hey, I'd be interested in putting a co-working space in place. Yeah, why don't we do that? So I think, there's guys like Jim Rogers, who's the chair of Mayo Ventures. He's behind that idea, that movement. So Jamie was working at Mayo and started working on this side thing and saying, hey, what if we do this? A couple of folks moved to Rochester from Hawaii because of a medical condition. And they said, this town's pretty cool, let's stick around. So they started a business there. They still have a business in Hawaii, they started one there, and they're investing in the co-working space. So as with anything, if anybody has read or hasn't read Brad Feld's Startup Communities, really important read, I think, because it really speaks to that ownership. I mean, to your point with rural America, it is the bootstraps. It's pulling yourself up, right? It's not like we're going to go in and help you. We're going to go in and support you. But at the end of the day, the people of Rochester had to say, this is a priority. We're going to create some sort of backing. And I think that there's not just the financial component, but it's guys like Jamie saying, hey, I want to go do this. And guys like Jim getting behind him and saying, yeah, I think that's a good idea. Not just for you, Jamie, but for our community if we want to grow. It's beneficial to Mayo to be able to build another ecosystem. Maybe and Mayo can make some investments in some of those, but also we're gonna get the best doctors in the world because we're gonna have a supportive community that allows them to bring their spouses and their kids here.
When you start looking, I don't know, somebody,
Yeah, and I was thinking about it would be really important to get buy-in from all aspects of a town's economy, not just people who are working in IT, but other local business owners, the family that runs the local grocery store. Because like you said, an example, like when a school shuts down in a small town, that town dies because the people that work at that school, like the teachers, janitors, whoever, they're not gonna be shopping at those local businesses.
Right.
So,
Yeah, it's absolutely a community thing, and maybe that's how the co-op, came about. Like, I don't know, but I would imagine that you have to kind of have the whole town rally around, and the city council should really be having those discussions of like, our population's dropping, we need to make this a priority.
yeah, and it impacts everyone.
a couple other points. First thing is, you would not be surprised, might be surprised at how much impact government regulations have, especially in like rural healthcare. That's really driven a lot of the doctors out.
Yeah.
And Medicare, Medicaid prices are dropping.
Yep.
And just other government regulations has impact too. The second point is, one of the things that are in just general development of the general economic ecosystem, and you see it here in the cities, you can see it in smaller microcosm anywhere else that's kind of thriving, is you have multiple industries. Up here, you have multiple industries. You mentioned it like Rochester. If you have a monocultural economic environment, you're always going to be tied to that.
Yep.
Whether it's a factory or a medical a destination medical center, you're going to have multiple industries there. In case there's a problem with one, the others can pick up the slack. But more importantly, people can communicate across those. They come up with new ideas. You get that. I'll use the term cross-pollination.
Mm-hmm.
You get new ideas developed, and that's one of the things that also needs to be done in a successful area. So whether it be across cities across that network, but more importantly, in the local area.
Which I think is important for the Rochesters and Fargos and everybody to come here, come to Minibar, right? Because that's I think one of the reasons this is such a successful conference is because people want to exchange ideas and not just front-end development ideas, but all these ideas.
Well, many demo used to go out to I think they've been up to Duluth, they've been to Rochester, I was there once for that, and so I don't know if they still do that.
Maybe, but I think there's an opportunity because I think that cross-pollination of ideas
Yes.
and just exposure to that different stuff. Like, I mean, part of it with parents, they're like, well, my kid, I gotta send him to school. Well, schools are in rural area or in urban areas that are going to be successful, so they're going to lose their kids. And where are the jobs? Well, the jobs are migrating toward more technology type of thing. So it's like, well, we're going to lose our kids to urban environments. So there needs to be some cross-pollination of ideas because if you're in Shenandoah, you probably don't even know that the world of tech is existing. So I think it's about exposing those towns to the potential.
It's interesting because, like, your job back here, right? You can be in a rural area. The largest employer by growth rate, Minnesota right now, hiring 1,800 tech jobs this year out of college, 1,800, right? They're not in a position immediately to go work from home, but 25% of their management workforce works remotely. And so really, if you really want to drive talent, it's a lot of times it's a spouse issue.
Yeah.
There's something driving the spouse back to mom or dad, grandma and grandpa, cultural values, and then can the spouse come? Well, can I work remotely? Well, do I have a corporate employer or a startup that will allow me to work remotely?
Well, and it's
facilitating that.
And it's the support. You can be a big part of building that town now. So you have that opportunity to help, go at your coffee shop, you make some friends down there and say, hey, you should come to Minibar.
Yeah, and that was my next question too. Was I definitely want to figure out the best way. I mean, just because it's a small town and and you stand out when you're just a new person in a small town, everyone's like, oh, what brought you here? What are you doing? It's like, well, wife wanted to, does small scale farming. We wanted our own, piece of land and like a homestead, farmstead thing, and so having a remote job let me move out there, and people are really welcoming and accommodating in that and curious about your job, and so even just kind of like getting that out there and letting people know that these types of jobs exist and they allow people to live in rural communities is already, I think, a powerful thing. But that was my next question, is like, yeah, what else could have a big impact in, especially like a small community like that? Maybe I can't like start a co-working space because it's 1,200 people, but maybe
Right.
there's some way I can get involved with the school or.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, anything you can do. I think that at the end of the day, the most pressing issue is awareness that this stuff exists, right? That's that cross-pollination of ideas. And if you're going into a school and you're talking to a 6th grade class or an 8th grade class and say, here's what I do every day, like that's huge. I think those are the important micro things that actually make change along the way. Because you might inspire one of those kids to go to school, and whether it's in that rural community or not, they might go to school, but they might, if they have the opportunity to come back, maybe they come back.
I think you also have to consider, my mom's a teacher, she does technology, I totally agree that you have to get into schools. But I also work in an industry that is targeted at farmers. And some farmers are really technologically advanced and they know more about the intricacies of the programs and the technology in their tractors than you can imagine. But then there are other large chunks of these rural communities that they don't understand what you can do with one of these.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't get it because they can't see it. They can see what it looks like to build a tractor. They can physically touch it, understand it, they can see things built. But sometimes when it's technology and it's code and you might need to educate the community a little bit more on, oh yeah, you created a website, so what? Well, let me explain to you what this does and why this is important, or whatever it might be.
Sure. Well, you have that opportunity too, because you could look and I mean, there's tons of stuff out there. You could Google, farming and technology, right? And you could show them like Land O'Lakes or the drone technology in Fargo. Like, here's how a drone can help you help your bottom line by knowing where is how most efficiently to water your crops. That's the kind of stuff that's, I think, changing. And again, it's just about awareness of bringing that, and it's the responsibility of each one of us to help kind of create that awareness.
I think you can kind of like find ways to tie code to things that are tangible in the community too, that aren't necessarily like, look at this piece of software, but it's like, look at this single screen theater that exists in Spring Grove, Minnesota because of code.
Yeah.
Like, maybe the building itself wasn't written in PHP, but it exists because people in the community were able to write code that brought money to the community, and then they were able to build that thing. And so there's so many tangible things in a community that you could point to and say, this was made possible by, this copper wire that runs into the hub in the middle of our
That's
city.
that's a good point. It's not just about getting coding jobs to people in the communities, but it's about allowing people who like to do those jobs to move there and help stimulate those economies and let people who want to have other types of businesses.
Well, and if you're an electrician and you show somebody like, hey, technology can really help you be a better electrician, like they pay attention to that kind of stuff. So to the point about theaters, like the part of the reason I made the film is to create that awareness. So if it's like you go check out a documentary and you end up, talking to somebody and saying like, hey, what is there a way we can expose the folks in our town more to the history of tech in Minnesota and what we've got going on here and how we might be able to be a part of that? Like that's why I made the film. So I would kind of plug it in that sense of creating that awareness of tech in Minnesota.
It seems like kind of back to what you were talking about originally when you first started the ideas is creating some kind of community hub where communities can talk to one another. One of the benefits there is you get these communities that have been really successful can have a space to tell their story about what they did and how they were successful to people in other communities that are like, hey, we want to do something here in this town in Minnesota, and you might connect to that one person in the town who comes to who heard that Rochester had something great happen. The opportunity to talk to people there and sort of like, how did you do this? How do I do this in my community? Who do I have to talk to?
Right, and that's why I wanted to bring up the examples. And I agree, Rochester is not necessarily a rural town, but I wanted to bring examples and common elements of how somebody in any town, no matter what size, can at least really look forward to or here's a formula, because it really is a formula. Like Startup Communities as a book is a formula of how to create a startup community.
And there's one other thing, we're focusing, I just can't think of this, we're focusing right now on information tech, primarily. I was to another conference earlier this week down in Iowa, the Iowa Biotech Conference, technology is not just information technology.
Sure.
It's materials, it's life sciences, biotech, it's energy, it's propulsion. There are other things, not just in information technology, that can be applied in rural Iowa. Maybe they'd be interested more in a biotech because they understand it.
Sure.
One of the things you have to look at is what are the cultural traditions and the genetic heritage of an organization, of an area.
Yep.
So they can orient themselves to it, and they can see that. So you kind of want to focus on that, and you're going to get less resistance from that because we're familiar with it. We don't maybe not know the details, but biotech, we're agriculture. We do it with livestock, we do it with plants. Biotech would be working something in that area with ag or life sciences. Or material science.
And that's why I said, figure out what you're good at and put in engage tech with that.
Yes.
Not just like, hey, let's go start a tech community.
Yes.
Let's do what we do and put tech inside of that.
But we can't just focus on like information tech, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Technology across the board.
Yep.
So,
All right, I think unless there's anything else, I think we should probably wrap up. Thanks for coming.